Welcome to Encore Learning Presents. We have a fantastic program today, and in fact, you might think that we saw the current headlines and we immediately got out and went out and found an appropriate speaker. And well, I don't know. Let's go with that story. I mean, today is all about deception and lies, so I'm going to go with that story. We're just responding to the headlines. But I'll introduce our speaker today. So today, we're delighted to have Nick Reynolds. Nick has been a lifetime student of World War II, and he's had a well-traveled career. He has a PhD from Oxford University, and he was officer in charge of field history for the Marine Corps. And later, he was historian for the CIA Museum at Langley, which has often been called the best museum you've never visited, and probably won't because it's not open to the public. If it was, I think we would definitely schedule a tour, but unfortunately it's not. And in addition to the book that we're profiling today, Nick has written a book, it actually has a New York Times bestseller book, which explores the adventures of Ernest Hemingway, including Hemingway's dalliance with the Soviet spy service. It's called Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy. It's definitely on my list of books to read. Sounds very interesting. Nick lives in Arlington with where he and his wife, Rebecca, take care of rescue pigs, which
Pugs, please.
Hogs, sorry, hogs.
Dogs.
Okay. Hogs. Hog, which I guess you call a group of hogs a drift or a drove, something like that.
No, dogs. We take care of dogs.
Oh, I'm sorry, dogs.
Yes.
Okay. My apologies.
No worries.
Okay. Anyway, so with that correction, please give a warm welcome to Nick Reynolds. Go ahead, you take it away, Nick.
Okay, thanks. Virtual applause. I heard it. Anyway, well, I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate that introduction. And I'm sitting here in the room where both of the books were written, with my library in some disarray, as you can see behind me. But I seem to know where to find things most of the time. I want to start off by saying a little more about my background. I am very much a product of this city, Washington, D.C. and its environment. I was born here. I was born downtown at the old Garfield Memorial Hospital at 10th and California. My parents were in the Foreign Service. Both of them worked for the State Department at various times. My dad had a full career. Mom stopped to raise a family. And so I grew up, that's where I was bitten by the bug, bitten by the travel bug, which I still suffer occasional relapses of that disease. And I think it's important to say that both of my parents, in addition to being in the Foreign Service, were products of World War II. That was one of the defining moments in their lives, and that sort of passes to the children. There are little habits that they learned during the war. There are turns of speech. There are conversations at the dinner table. There are friends who stop by who might have been war heroes or victims in some way and told very interesting stories. So that is the genesis of my interest in World War II. And a lot of the books that you can't quite see here are World War II books, and they always have been. So ever since I could read, I was reading about World War II. So this book, which you see behind me on my desk, is a World War II book primarily. And it is it's a mix of my two major interests, one being the war and the other being intelligence, something that I got into over time. I think you followed. So first I I had the PhD. I served in the Marine Corps. I was an infantry officer, and then I migrated to the Marine Corps' tiny history office, which had 12 or so people, and had a career there of 10 or 15 years, mostly as a reservist, partly on active duty. And it was such a neat job. We wrote, we deployed to operations, and we would collect oral histories. It was like being a war correspondent, really. And then you came back and you wrote up your experiences, and you would produce monologues and books. In the CIA, I was not just the historian. I was a generalist initially. I'm a trained case officer, deployed overseas a couple times. But towards the end of my career, I got back to my love of history, and was lucky enough to be the historian for that museum for about 5 years. And yes, I'm afraid it is the best museum you never saw, though you can see a fair bit online. You can go to cia.gov and navigate to the museum and get a pretty decent tour. And occasionally the CIA offers tours to members of the press or academics, somebody with a research interest in a related subject, and they'll take them around. So you can get a fair idea of what it's like, even if you're not lucky enough to visit. So as you probably see where this is going, this book is a combination of those interests, World War II and intelligence, and the spark for it comes from an old friend of mine named David Tate, who is the author of a book called Codebreakers. And Codebreakers was the first big book on code breaking in America, which was more or less a taboo subject until David published in the 1960s. And David always used to say, you know, nobody writes bigger histories of intelligence. Nobody writes the general history of American intelligence or intelligence in World War II. So I gave myself that task to write what sort of an overview of the origins of American intelligence in World War II. So, and there's still nobody has written like there are a general history of intelligence in World War II. There are general histories of World War II. There's a number of multi volume histories that are very good that are coming out these days. Richard B. Frank, Ian Toll, people like that. But we're still waiting for somebody to write a general history of intelligence in World War II. So to recap, what we have is the we have up to now we've had the slices of the American pie. There are a lot of books on American intelligence in World War II, but nobody before me has spent a lot of time looking at that pie as a whole, and that's what I try and do in this book. So I often get asked, so the book covers the American experience in World War II and intelligence, so basically 1940 to late 1945, and tells you it's not exhaustive. So I didn't, in the 400 or 500 pages that the publisher vouchsafed, I did not try and cover everything. I tried to cover representative subjects and the general trends that were ongoing, and I tried to fit them into the context of the war. So what do you see? Why would anyone want to read this book unless they're a student in a course and it's assigned as a reading? But there's a few things that come out. I think there's a lot of interesting war stories in here. There's a lot of I try to tell the story through the eyes of people who were participants. And so I try and give you a feeling for what it was like to be involved in intelligence in World War II. And I think there's some interesting stories there, interesting looks at the individuals that I'll talk about a little later. So that's one reason to read the story. Another is to appreciate the arc that occurred between 1940 and 1946, 47, and that is there's almost no organized American intelligence before World War II. Almost no, almost none. So there's a little bit here and there, but when you consider the scale of intelligence that we're accustomed to today, it's hard to imagine that there was a time in the not too distant past when there was almost nothing. So I described that arc, and I try to convey the argument that if you're going to be a great power, you better have a professional intelligence organization. That's the meaning of the title, Need to Know, which is usually taken as a restrictive principle that you only tell people what they need to know to do their job. What I'm trying to do here is say the country needs to know what's going on in the world if it wants to be a legitimate great power. Another thing that I look at here is an important trend that I think I stress more than others, and that is the importance of professionalization. So what we see before World War II are some remarkable achievements, especially in code breaking, and the Japanese code's broken by 1940, and we're able to read a lot of what the Japanese diplomatic code, we're able to read pretty much what the Japanese ambassador in Washington's reading. And that's a remarkable achievement, but it's not the same as finished intelligence. And the country during the war goes from having unprocessed secret information at its disposal to, by the end of the war, the capability to break codes and fit the information into finished intelligence. So if you're a decision maker, you can see the significance of that. And I'll get into that a little bit later in more detail, especially if you're interested. One more thing that emerges from this is how much we as Americans like technology, how much we like things that involve machines and science as opposed to the softer disciplines. So you see in code breaking, the American decision makers are very positive about code breaking, and there's mechanization. It's not quite computerization yet, but there's mechanization that occurs during the war. So so business machines turn into something like early computers to help break enemy codes. And by the end of the war, we're doing it on an industrial scale. You almost feel sorry for the enemy because their messages are so thoroughly compromised. So in this book, I'm trying to do a hybrid a little bit. I tried very hard to make it readable, something that a reader could pick up, enjoy without worrying over much about the academic structure. But that's footnotes. Footnotes flow through my veins. So there are footnotes, or rather endnotes. So anyone who wants to delve further is able to do so. There's about 100 pages of notes. Again, thanks to the publisher for putting up with that. My sources are a mix of secondary sources, primary sources, and original sources. A lot of this book was written during the pandemic. I had done a couple years of research before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, I was to a great extent in this room working, and I found out, to my great pleasure, that there's a great deal of information that is available online, and this is thanks to archive systems and library systems especially in the United States and Great Britain. The Roosevelt Library, Roosevelt was president for most of the time covered in this book. The Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, has digitized over 800,000 pages of his records, which makes a historian's life much simpler than it used to be before. In the old days, you went in person to the archive. FDR Library happens to be a wonderful place to visit. It's too bad you don't have to go there to get all the information anymore, but you would look at a finding aid, and then you would ask for the file, and then you would page through a paper file. You might order copies or take notes, and then you would come home. Now you can go back and forth any number of times. So you see a file that you like, you take some general notes, you decide to use it, and you're able to revisit it without much trouble, without leaving home. I would also add that various three-letter agencies have digitized World War II files. So there's CIA, NSA, and FBI. And again, pretty accessible just by going to their electronic reading rooms. So it's possible to do a lot of things more efficiently than you could do before. That said, I still like my my memoirs. My favorites are probably the authors who kept diaries at the time, so they're not relying on their memories to write something a few years after the war, but rather every day they write something down, and then it's published after the war, and I can go back to them. And there's a couple of great sources that I relied on to do this book. So what I would like to do now for a few more minutes, and then I'll take questions, is to shift to a little slideshow that talks about the individuals who are involved in the war. So David, if I could ask you, okay, so I think that's he's the end of this, or is he the beginning? There we go. So Joe, yeah, there we go. So the reason I do this is I told you I tried to tell the story through the eyes of the participants. And I also want to make a little bit of the greatest generation argument. There's just something special about the World War II generation. That's not just because my parents were involved and I loved and respected them. But there was a remarkable amount of talent. There was a remarkable spirit. And I think we see that in this intelligence story as well as we see this in any battlefield story. Of course, there was some strife. Of course, there were people who were scoundrels. But overall, you had a remarkable team of individuals coming together enough to defeat the enemy. And I'm going to talk about a few of those and the greater points that they illustrate. Next slide, please. Next, so one of this, there are two huge personalities in this book, and they're sitting there in the chairs. So Roosevelt on the left and Churchill on the right, and they are both involved in intelligence to varying degrees. Churchill really is the old pro. He's been in government so long. He was present at the creation of MI5 and MI6. He both ran naval intelligence as it came under him. He ran it in that sense. And he is just a really savvy consumer of intelligence and a manager of intelligence who almost without fail does the right moves when you're talking about how to organize that activity. Roosevelt, I'm afraid, does not score as well as a manager and consumer of intelligence. He is too wed to his habits as a politician to have been that good at intelligence. I say he's a supremely gifted politician and a great wartime leader, but he never really gets beyond the, let's say, cottage industry stage of intelligence, where that he views as picking up information, tidbits from people that he likes and trusts, other people who have similar backgrounds to him. But thankfully, on the American side, we have a very savvy gentleman, and that is General Marshall, standing there at right in the lighter colored uniform. And General Marshall is pretty much the senior guy in the Army, and not quite the same as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but something like that until Admiral Leahy comes along later in the war. And next to him, you see Admiral King, and this is a hard-driving Navy officer who makes things happen. He is not a great. He's nobody's. He's not my idea of a manager who makes things happen in an enlightened way, but he has a very strong personality, and he does make things happen, and he does come to appreciate intelligence. Next slide, please. So here's one of the surprises in my book is that I say nice things about Henry L. Stimson. Henry L. Stimson usually is remembered as the man who said, "Gentlemen, don't read each other's mail," and closing down an American black chamber that is a code-breaking operation around 1930. Stimson, in my eyes, is a great supporter of intelligence in World War II. So here's a guy who's learned from experience, he's adapted, and he's just, he's sort of the best of the old guard. He's been Secretary of State, Secretary of War twice, Governor General of the Philippines, in addition to running a Wall Street law firm and having 2 estates. He's got one up on Long Island, and he owns Murray, where Murray School is in Woodley Park. He owns the estate that was the house, the main house at the school is his old house, and it was surrounded by 17 acres. Can you imagine that? A 17-acre estate in Washington, D.C. during World War II. And so what he did for fun was go back to Woodley, and he could ride horseback for a couple hours without ever leaving his own property. He's 72 when he comes to Washington at a time of life when, so it's 1940, a time of life when he could easily have said, "Look, I'm too old, I'm tired, I've done my bit, I've had all these senior jobs, let someone else do it." But no, he comes and he's in there pitching through the end of the war, through 1945. He steps down in 1945. So my hat's off to him. And in his case, the hat would have been something like this old-fashioned boater here. So an unexpected hero in the history of intelligence in World War II. I present you with Henry L. Stimson. Next, please. So in this book, you see, especially early on, since America is so unprepared for war, you see guys who managed to do things with very few resources at their disposal. And this is one of my heroes. This is Joe Rochefort, shown here as a Navy captain. And this is a guy who never finishes, who only finishes high school after World War II. He retires. He retires, as an 06, and he's going to look for jobs as a retiree. And he's got all these accomplishments from his naval career, and he can't get a job as an entry-level job because he doesn't have a high school diploma. So he doesn't. So not only does he not have a high school diploma, He doesn't have a college diploma, and he didn't attend the Naval Academy. This at a time when you really weren't on the fast track in the Navy if you hadn't graduated from the Naval Academy. So he more or less designs his own career field. He learns Japanese, he learns traffic analysis, he learns code breaking, he learns enough of the culture of the Japanese Navy to be able to think like one of their commanders. And he is the man who brings us the Battle of Midway. He develops the information that shows that Midway is the target of the Japanese fleet, and thereby, and he has to lobby for it. So it's not like there's a system that he just says, okay, he fills out a form and says, oh, the Japanese fleet's going to be over here, and pushes a button, and it's done. He has to fight for his analysis of this information. And at times it's a bitter fight, and he's at a disadvantage because he's not a Naval Academy graduate. He's not one of the boys, and yet he persists, and we get this great victory, the first major victory in the Pacific Ocean, and also that stops the Japanese expansion to the west. Without Joe Rochefort, the Japanese might well have captured Midway, and then they might have gone on to capture Hawaii. So that's speculation. But so next we have William Friedman, another one of my heroes. William F. Friedman was born in the Russian Empire. He happened to be Jewish. So like a lot of Jews in the Russian Empire, a good thing to do was to leave. And he really grew up in this country, and culturally, he is as really not as American as apple pie. He's always a little bit of an outsider, but he's formed in this country, and he is very, very, very good with math, and falls into code breaking in World War I through an interesting chain of events. And then he, like Rochefort, is another guy who persists even though the system doesn't really support him that strongly. He's involved with code breaking in the 20s and 30s when Stimson shuts it down. He stays at it. He keeps the files. He keeps the candle burning. He hires good people. He has maybe 10 or 15 people. I don't know how many people work at NSA, but I'll tell you, it's more than 10 or 15 today. And, and that's what Friedman had. That was the American code breaking establishment run by the Army in between the wars. They worked in World War I temporary buildings on the National Mall. The Army had one and the Navy had one, and they were between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. And they were there until the Nixon administration. And these buildings were hot in the summer and cold in the winter. And they each had procedures for sending the employees home when it was too cold or especially too hot. And it was more often people were sent home because it was just too hot and they couldn't figure out how to cool it. Anyway, Friedman leads the team that breaks the Japanese diplomatic code in 1940, and it's just a phenomenal achievement. And they basically do it with a yellow pad and a pencil. So there's people sitting in a room looking at pages of numbers in groups of 5, trying to find patterns. And it's a little like, so I'm a word person, but my wife's a numbers person, and she does Sudoku, and I do crosswords and scrambles, but it's a little like doing Sudoku all day. They sit in silence until somebody sees a relationship between a set of numbers, and then they take it from there. And ultimately, they leverage that insight from a yellow pad into making a machine at home at night. One of Friedman's deputies is a tinkerer, and he and another guy basically in the garage and in the basement, they create an infernal machine. And that infernal machine reverse engineers the Japanese process so they can feed in the intercepted decrypts, the intercepted messages from Tokyo that are still encrypted, put it into the machine, and the decrypt comes out the other end. Again, just a phenomenal achievement. Friedman, by the way, is like his assistant, is an inventor and a tinkerer. Here he is with one of his inventions, and he creates a code machine for the US that is used widely in World War II and never broken by the enemy. Next, please. So this is Alfred T. McCormick, who works with Friedman. Then you can see that he's dedicated this picture to Friedman. On the lower right, you see Bill Friedman. It says, "To whom we owe a great deal." And Friedman is a Wall Street lawyer, works in a big firm called Cravath, Swaine and Moore, which is still in existence. And Stimson, who I mentioned earlier, after Pearl Harbor says, we obviously missed something there. We had these, we broke into the Japanese diplomatic code, but we were surprised by Pearl Harbor. How did that happen? And what can we do going forward in this war to make sure we do the best job possible of using signals intelligence? And Stimson's assistant, McCloy, says, "I got just the guy for you, this Wall Street lawyer, McCormick, who's also a history buff and just a very organized, dynamic guy." McCormick comes down to Washington, works for very low wages. It might have been $1 a day, $1 a year, man, I'm not sure. But certainly the government didn't pay him what he was making on Wall Street. And he works these killer hours. Again, sort of like Stimson, stays for the duration. And what he gives us is the system that I alluded to earlier. He shows us a way, develops a way to take raw information and turn it into something like finished intelligence. So before the war, you might have gotten, if you were a decision maker in Washington, you might have gotten a Japanese message that was snatched out of the ether. It was decrypted, translated, and so you would see what the Japanese ambassador was seeing, and it would say something like, Tokyo directs you to take the following negotiating position on the oil embargo. And so you would be handed that piece of paper for a few minutes in the morning, and somebody is standing there waiting for you to finish reading it, and they take it back and they burn it. And Friedman and McCormick say this is like letting somebody watch a movie a frame at a time, a day at a time, and they never see it running together. McCormick is the guy who comes up with a system for letting people see the whole movie and appreciate it. It's a phenomenal achievement, and it's done by a guy with absolutely no training in intelligence, nothing, zero zip. And he gives us this phenomenal gift during the war. Next slide, please. So this is the man who's usually associated with American intelligence in World War II. This is another Wall Street lawyer, William J. Donovan, and he is a man of the world, as you might guess from this picture. He makes a lot of money processing. Basically, Donovan Leisure, the firm that he founded on Wall Street, they get rich in the Depression handling bankruptcies. And so he's got a fancy apartment overlooking the East River. He's got a mansion in Georgetown, which is still there, by the way. It was subsequently owned by Katharine Graham of the Washington Post. And it's obvious to most people that Donovan and the law, he doesn't have a love affair with his chosen profession, the law. He's looking for something else in life. And he travels the world holding informal discussions with famous people. He rides to the sound of the guns. If there's a war on somewhere, he wants to go and observe and just find out what's going on. He takes his wife on a world cruise, hears there's a war in Siberia or whatever, and he says, we'll see, I've got to go to the war, and you can get home on your own. So in World War II, he is the man more chosen by the British. The British want, we have almost no intelligence, as I say, and the British are looking for somebody who they can count on to be their partner in intelligence. They're not exactly looking for a spy. They're not trying to penetrate the American government, but they want a partner. They want a channel into the administration. They eventually want a way of getting, of tapping American resources, and they decide Donovan is the guy for them. And they play a role in grooming him and in promoting him with the administration. They have a massive office in New York. There are up to 1,000 people working at this office, and they are involved in all kinds of skullduggery. And Donovan is one small part of that. And eventually so it's like buying penny stock. Eventually the penny stock flourishes, and Donovan becomes the coordinator of information for President Roosevelt, and then he becomes the director of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, parts of which eventually morph into CIA. So an important part of the story, but not the biggest part of the story. And he is, I argue in the book that he's playing catch-up ball a lot of the time, because he's competing against signals intelligence, and signals intelligence is flourishing, and he is still inventing his part of human intelligence and special operations. So think spies when you hear human intelligence, special operations, think commandos jumping into German-held territory and working with the resistance. So one more, please. So at the end of the war, 1945, President Roosevelt dies in April 1945, so he does not live to see the end of the war. And Winston Churchill, amazingly, is voted out of office. And so you get Clement Attlee here on the left, the bald man with the little mustache in the chair. So you've got some new talent. Joe Stalin's hardly new talent, and you've got old Molotov behind him. But Harry Truman is one of my heroes here, and he kind of picks up the ball at the end of the war, and doesn't exactly score a touchdown, but certainly plays a decent game. He fires Donovan. He says Donovan is not the guy we want in peacetime, and I argue that he's right to do that. But he says Donovan's ideas are not wrong, namely the idea that we need a peacetime intelligence service. And out of these discussions eventually grows CIA and the whole post-war intelligence organization. One last a word about the gentleman on the left there, who is Admiral Leahy. Admiral Leahy is one of the forgotten people of World War II. And he is part of, I mentioned, sort of the Greatest Generation and the remarkable team that were working on intelligence. And he is right up there. He's been Chief of Naval Operations before World War II. He hit he topped out in the Navy. he got ready to retire, and President Roosevelt said, "Would you mind going to Puerto Rico to be the governor?" And Leahy says, "Well, all right, sir." And then he goes, and then we get into the war, and Roosevelt says, "I really need somebody to go be the ambassador in Vichy, France." And he goes again. And then after that, which is an insanely tough job, after that, his wife dies while he's in Vichy, representing our interests, and he has to figure out how to get her body back to the United States. So this is a point at which the Germans occupy half of France, and travel is insanely difficult. But he somehow manages, and he and his wife and his son are buried here in Arlington. After that, he is the de facto national security advisor and chief of the Joint Staff, and he is really the senior military and naval officer in the country, and plays an enormous role in the decisions about war and peace, and then the future of American intelligence after the war. So he says, we need intelligence now more than ever. We can't go back to the way things were before the war. And the main reason is not Joe Stalin, that comes a little later, but atomic weapons. He says Pearl Harbor was an intelligence failure, and we cannot afford another Pearl Harbor, especially since the next Pearl Harbor may be an atomic Pearl Harbor, and that is something we need to guard against. So I'm going to leave it there, and I would love to answer questions.
Yeah, so we do have a question, and it has to do with what was Henry Stimson's role during the war, and what did he come to DC to do?
So he is Secretary of War, and he came. He already owned Woodley, so it was hardly a hardship transfer. But he came to be Secretary of War, and the Secretary of War at this time is basically about the U.S. Army, because there's a corresponding, the Navy there's a Secretary of the Navy, but there's no Secretary of Defense. So he basically runs the Army establishment, and the code breakers, the Army code breakers, Friedman, McCormick, those guys basically work for him, and he promotes the activities. When he first got there, they were scared to death that he would once again say, gentlemen, don't read each other's mail, close down your code breaking. And one of the senior military guys goes a back channel to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt says, "Oh, just don't tell them what you're doing." And just do this in secret, which would have been an impossible proposition. And so the Army code breaking establishment says, well, let's see if we can win him over. And they invite him for a tour, and he is enthralled. He says, "This is wonderful. Good job. You're doing God's work." And there's this huge sigh of relief. And then as the war progresses, he gives it all the support it needs. And plus, he's a good consumer. So he's a much better consumer than the president. And as I say, the best consumers are guys like Marshall.
Okay, we also have a question about, what about Allen Dulles? I know you do cover him a fair amount in the book, so maybe you can talk about his role during the war and after the war.
Sure. So Allen Dulles is another New York lawyer. I mean, are we seeing a pattern here yet? He's kind of a rival. He's a rival, a frenemy, a colleague to Donovan. He's a little younger than Donovan, and he works for Donovan in OSS, and Donovan is not blown away by Donovan doesn't go, I got Alan Dulles here, let's let him reach his potential. He tries to make him the deputy in London and of the OSS office there, and Dulles says, no, better give me my own post. And so he goes to Switzerland, and he gets there just before the borders closed. You could go through Vichy, France, where at roughly the same time as poor Admiral Leahy's going the other way with his dead wife, and gets into Switzerland, and out of nothing, really, he establishes an intelligence operation there, and he basically develops the same kinds of operations that you're going to see post-war in CIA. So one of them is old-fashioned spying, which is an individual human being brings you secret documents from the enemy's safe, and I cover that. So I have a chapter on him with 4 parts, and one part is about conventional espionage. Another part is about his relations with the German resistance to Hitler, and he has to walk a fine line there because he's getting information about the German resistance to Hitler, but neither the American nor the British government wants to encourage them in their activities. So he wants to champion them, but he can't. Another thing that he does is work with the other side in Germany. He negotiates a settlement in on the Italian front in late so April, May, just before the main collapse of Germany and then VE Day. He sets up this surrender. It's called Operation Sunrise, and so out of this you see Dulles drawing conclusions as to what a spy agency could do after the war. So he's basically saying, I've done the test bed for you, and this is something we can do later on.
Yeah, so while we're covering all the different individuals involved here, we have someone singing the praises of Elizabeth Smith Friedman, who they mentioned was a noteworthy code breaker, maybe more so than her husband, William Friedman. And this person indicates that she dedicated her life to memorializing her husband in death. In using his notes and noting his accomplishment, making sure his accomplishments were known to history. So as an NSA pioneer. So I don't know if that's covered in your book, or maybe you did research.
I don't spend a lot of time on Elizabeth Friedman. Everything you said is true. And the reason I don't spend a lot of time on Mrs. Friedman is what I'm doing is I'm up at 30,000 feet and I'm looking at the big blue arrows, and who built who was laying the foundations that you're going to see after the war. Mrs. Friedman did great work. She was a good code breaker in her own right. She worked for the Coast Guard in between the wars, and then in World War II, the Coast Guard gets taken up by the Navy, so she's part of the Navy code breaking establishment. And after the war, she's a big supporter of her husband, who has numerous breakdowns, depending on the way you count them. He probably has something like 5 nervous breakdowns. I don't know how many involve hospitalization. I do cover one in 1940 where he is in Walter Reed for 3 months, and he's just exhausted by his work, basically. And he also struggled with alcohol and depression. So yes, hats off to Mrs. Friedman. There's a great biography of her. by a gentleman named Jason Fagone, Fagone. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. And nobody's done there's no modern biography of William F. Friedman. So I hope that's coming along eventually.
Okay, thanks for covering that. So we have a question. I think during World War II, which of the following intelligence services performed most effectively? Looking at among the Allied countries as well as the Axis countries, and which would you rate most effective? With the realization that intelligence effectiveness may be kind of a complex question. So
yes,
yeah.
So for sure, I'll underline that part of the question. So you have winners and losers in the intelligence game in World War II, and probably the gold star. I would award the gold. Let's take the probably out of there. I've been thinking about this for years. The gold star's got to go to the Brits. They come away with gold, and that's really for their code breaking. And the fact that the code breaking leads to finished intelligence that's put to good use. And they have a deception program that's very successful. They make some mistakes, but by and large, they do a very good job of coming up with information, using that information, and protecting that information. I give us high marks in the code breaking department, not quite as high as the British, but pretty close. And as the war goes on, you see American code breaking and British code breaking learning to work together. It's sort of like dating. They're very cautious dealing with each other, but by the end of the war, they are almost literally in bed together and come up with agreements that persist in the post-war period. The Germans are good at tactical things, but they're good at things that involve process. They've got a couple of things that are not in their favor. First of all, the ultimate consumer is crazy. And secondly, their racial policies are self-defeating because a lot of great code breakers are victims of the Third Reich, and they have gone over to the Allied side. So Germans are like C plus, maybe B minus. The Soviets have an A in human intelligence because they're very good at spying on people. They run a network of spies. They have the advantage that they can use the Communist Party apparatus. And even in the United States, they have a good number of spies who are reporting back to Moscow. Their disadvantage is that they too have a guy at the top who is not always willing to listen to read the handwriting on the wall. He gets something like 80 warnings that Hitler's going to invade in 1941 and disregards them all. And that was almost the end of the Stalinist regime. So Japanese, little bit similar, not terrible, but they're in the C range. They can do certain things, but they don't have the vision that we see on the Allied side.
Yeah, that's a very interesting rundown. So clearly it matters not just the quality of the intelligence, but what you do with it, which kind of leads to the next question, which talks about the strategic use of intelligence as far as making it public. And we've seen recently that the current administration has made intelligence public to serve the national needs, for example, with the Ukraine war, as well as the Chinese spy balloon. So maybe you can talk about that as one aspect, and maybe how has that changed? Did we do that type of thing back in World War II that we're seeing currently?
The answer would have to be not if we could help it. There were American code breaking in Washington became an open secret in Washington during the war, and there were people. There were allusions on, in speeches on the floor of Congress and the Senate, and if the Japanese had had a really good clipping service, they might have started asking questions. But as far as I know, the policy was not to release information, and even after information had been released, inadvertently was to do what you can to do damage control rather than come out and say, okay, we knew this all along, or make ourselves look good because we had anticipated a move, and we anticipated because we had good intelligence. So short answer is that we tried not to. There were some major leaks, but we tried to control the damage to the maximum extent possible.
So some of the releases that have done, particularly with the Ukraine war, where we've released information we had on imminent attacks, we've released that publicly. Is that a relatively new strategy?
So I'm trying to think of the last time that, and especially if there's any World War II events. I think if you go back, you'd have to go back. I don't know where, I can't think off the top of my head of other times where we said see. I mean, in Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe President Kennedy would have come out with. Actually, he did. He came out with the pictures of the overhead and said, "There's a missile here. There's a missile there," and they say there's no missiles. So yeah, not unheard of, but in my bailiwick, in the World War II context, I'm going to stick with no.
Okay, thanks for that. And could you explain what happened or didn't with the information we had about Pearl Harbor?
Great question. Thank you for that. So Pearl Harbor is a failure on a number of levels. It's a leadership failure. It's a failure of imagination, and it's an intelligence failure. And it's an intelligence failure in the sense that we did not have the information we needed, and the decision makers did not act. There were no indicators saying the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor. So you could say we should have been able to do something to gather that information. It's not impossible. So remember, please, the codes that we broke before Pearl Harbor were the Japanese diplomatic codes. So these were not military or naval codes. We didn't see anything that said, on this day, we're going to attack at this point. That said, so there was no tactical warning, and there's your intelligence failure. There was a strategic warning in the sense that you could tell from the Japanese diplomatic traffic that we were going to go to war. So it's like you could send out a message, and there was a war warning sent out, I believe November 28th, 1941. You could send out a message saying there might be a war with Japan in the near future, but we don't know where and how it's going to start. So then the question becomes, well, what do you make of the commanders at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel and General Short? Should they have given a general warning, not a specific warning? Should they have done something different? I tend to the answer that yeah, their aggressive patrolling would have been my choice if I were in their shoes and were able to play the game over again. And they didn't do that. Instead, they guarded against sabotage. But I often get asked, did Roosevelt know the war was coming and let it happen anyway? And my answer to that is no. He did not know, and he's unlikely to have let it happen, even if he did. He loved the Navy. He hated reading about the ships sunk at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, okay. That's a great coverage of that topic. And also, we've got a couple questions. I'm going to combine them, even though they're probably material areas in their own right. But it has to do with relationships between allies. So what kind of intelligence information is shared between allies? And also, was there a realization early on that we need intelligence about our World War II allies, the Soviets, the Brits, and de Gaulle? So, I mean, you can, take those separately or weave them together. I think there's quite a bit there to chew on, probably.
So intelligence sharing with and collecting on is what I heard in the question.
Yeah. Great summarization.
So sharing with is primarily a matter of Britain and the United States sharing, especially code-breaking information as the war goes on. And then you have to fold in de Gaulle and the Free French, and it gets pretty complicated. What you do see a good case study that addresses this issue is D-Day, where you have different reporting streams coming together to an intelligence headquarters and being developed and shared with the decision makers. So you see the products of code breaking, aerial reconnaissance, and basically reports from the French resistance on the ground, giving you a pretty good picture of what to expect on D-Day. Not a perfect picture, but a pretty good picture. And I argue that D-Day was an intelligence success. Did we share with the Russians? Not really. There were some moves to do that. I cover one. Donovan makes an attempt. J. Edgar Hoover is suspicious of them, rightly so, actually, because they were running spies in the Roosevelt administration. But there's surprisingly little cooperation between the Soviet Union and the Western allies beyond the conferences where the leaders meet and they put big blue arrows on the map, and that includes intelligence as well. Somebody said that for much of the war, what happened was the U.S. and Britain sent war material to the Soviet Union. They would get to the dock up there in Archangel or wherever in the far north. They would drop the things on the dock and sail home. And the cooperation was not organized beyond that. That may be a little extreme, but I think there's more than a grain of truth in that. So that was sharing information again. So your allies. So Stalin's the hands down winner here. He's collecting information on the Western allies. He's got information on the Manhattan Project. So he knows what's going on in a lot of, in parts of the British and American government. The U.S. knows very little about the Soviet Union, has really no collection abilities in the Soviet Union. It's really pretty much a closed box. And it's fun to read the memoirs of the diplomats and military attaches who were assigned there. It's really a grim business. I mean, you get what little grains of information the Soviets are willing to push your way. You're really circumscribed in where you can go, what you can do in Moscow. When Donovan flies in in the end of 1943, December 1943, to talk to them about possible intelligence cooperation. He gets his business done. He basically makes the proposal to them in a couple of days, and then he says, okay, I'm done here, I want to fly out. They don't let him fly out for about 10 days, and they have bureaucratic bureaucratic obstacles to flying out that may be trumped up, that may be just the Soviet bureaucracy working the way it worked for much of the existence of the Soviet Empire. But that kind of gives you an idea of what the relations between the two were like, and shows you also that the Soviets knew more. The Soviets had more information about what we were doing than we had about what they were doing. Did they make good use of that information? That's a different question.
Yeah, actually, a follow-up question. Do the Soviets have an advantage all the way up to the current day because they have a very closed society versus open society, the rest of the free world?
Well, that might have been some of it. I mean, it's a partial advantage, but it's not one that I would want to have. I'd far rather take my chances with a more open society where information travels more freely, because the downside of the Soviet system is you have a Stalin, right? And
I
Stalin
just mean in terms of intelligence gathering.
Just in terms of gathering, so maybe a little bit. It's easier for a Soviet spy in World War II to make his way around the United States than the other way around. So yeah, a little bit. I think our code, did we intercept Soviet messages and break them? I'll bet the Brits did, and I'd be surprised if we did.
Okay, actually, that leads very well into another question. In 1940, to what extent did the British example, I assume their intelligence operation, and possibly subversive influence help to build U.S. intelligence capabilities and the role of William Stevenson?
So he's the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, who he's basically in charge of this huge office based in New York that promotes American intelligence more early on in the war, 1940, maybe 42, 43. And then the Americans kind of get tired of him and limit his activities, because he's sort of like an aggressive parent-in-law. You just get tired of being told, okay, you need to take the trash out, or that you're not educating the child in the right way, or why didn't you fix the car? They provide a fair bit of assistance early on, especially in designing OSS, but later on they're regarded in Washington as akin to not completely, but there's like enough already. We get it. Donovan likes them through the end, but other people are kind of fed up with them, and that includes J. Edgar Hoover, who's a pretty powerful guy who plays an important supporting role in this story.
But I mean, I guess it is true from reading the book that the quality of the British intelligence kind of helped push the U.S. to additional levels of excellence.
Yes, I would say that. So you see, so in code breaking, for instance, you see, so the British have the Germans have a code machine called Enigma, and with help from European allies, they have exploited Enigma, and so they go through different stages of sharing with us. So initially, they're willing to show us how they break German codes, but they're not willing to show us the products of that process. And so they're not willing to share conclusions with us. And it takes a while for the process to become transparent to the allies. But by the end of the war, pretty much the British and the American code breaking systems are interlocking, and they're supported by sort of collateral collection, if you will. So an example is the U-boat war. In the U-boat war, so you start by breaking U-boat traffic, right? You start by breaking a message to the U-boat that says go to grid square XYZ, and then you add to that, you add something like radio direction finding. So when the U-boat replies, acknowledge, will do, and then there's like 20 or 30 allied stations around the North and South Atlantic, and they do radio direction finding. And so they say the U-boat, when it transmitted, was approximately here. And then after that, you get British and American hunter-killer teams who go out there and search for that U-boat. And eventually, this is an enormously successful undertaking. You almost feel sorry for the Germans because they lose something like 760 U-boats in the course of the war. And when you lose a U-boat, it's not like many people got off and got into the life rafts. It's the U-boat is sunk in deep water, and all the guys go with it.
Yeah. So you also mentioned previously that the effectiveness of intelligence is also dependent upon the leaders and whether the consumers of intelligence are keyed in, using it properly. So what are the characteristics of a good consumer of intelligence?
So there's, so this is intelligence is a strange beast, because you on the one hand you need the system to work right. Okay, you need you need collection to be right, you need analysis to be right, you need distribution to be right, you need to be offering the product to the right consumers. If it's Navy, you've got to find the guy in the Navy who makes the decisions about the activity that you're reporting on. But one thing, maybe this is something for AI these days. One thing you can't do is train the ultimate consumer. So, in World War II, was somebody going to train President Roosevelt to be a better consumer, or Stalin, or let alone somebody like Hitler? You can socialize. You can take steps in that direction. You can try and make your consumer comfortable in various ways. You can try and anticipate what he or she wants, but ultimately that side of the equation is almost always going to be problematic. What you can do is, so this goes back to Pearl Harbor. So you look at Pearl Harbor, and I occasionally get a question like, but what about the message that said, the fleet was steaming in this direction, or the consulate in Honolulu was supposed to report on the location of the ships in the harbor? Well, yes, okay, there was that, but that, so what if somebody had taken that down to Pearl Harbor, gotten Admiral Kimmel to focus on it, and said, okay, here's a message that we think is real, that shows the Japanese are interested in the location of the ships at your base. So the problem with that is that it's a one-off, right? So for Admiral Kimmel to have acted on it, you would need reporting that covers related subjects and shows trends. So I don't blame Admiral Kimmel that he didn't act on one-off reports that say this or that is going to happen. Does that make any sense? So the intelligence system has to be such that a consumer is going to want to buy it, right? You want a car that does certain things, and then it's up to the driver where he takes it. But it's up to the intelligence part to design a car that works, where the various systems are mesh.
Yeah, I think today you also hear a lot about level of confidence that I guess gets embedded in reports as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But okay, so Mary Jo wants to ask, or was asking about, is there a specific event that triggered the significant increase in the U.S. Effort to pursue intelligence? Obviously Pearl Harbor, but she is also mentioning maybe before Pearl Harbor. And I'll just add, I know Pearl Harbor was described as an intelligence failure, but then Midway, not so much later, was considered an intelligence success, and kind of what transpired between those two to change things.
So that's, you know, I'm not sure Pearl Harbor and Midway are the right before and afters, looking at the bigger picture, because it's basically the same guys doing the same stuff, but they get it right, and they, you know, they make this system of bubble gum and paper clips. You know, this Midway is still the time where the system hasn't really changed that much, but the loaners have kind of gotten together and done a really good job with the limited resources that they had. You don't see the U.S. really breaking into things until later in the war. You see the industrialization of intelligence, if you will, I would say is 43, 44 on. Midway is the brilliant, you know, it's kind of the end of the old system of the loaners and the guys who happen to be in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing. I'll give you a small example. The people, many of the enlisted working in the dungeon, as they called it, it's underground. It's in the basement of a building at Pearl Harbor. It's where they do their work, and so they're not trained intel guys. They're the band of the USS California, which was either sunk or damaged on December 7th. They got nothing to do. Their ship isn't going to sail anytime soon. But these guys have the you know, music is related to numbers and patterns and whatnot. So they hijack these musicians and put them to work in code breaking. That is not a sophisticated, trained mature code breaking operation. That is a brilliant improvisation. And so we've got to look at later in the war to see the you know, the mature professional organizations emerging. Okay,
can you give our viewers a sense of the just vast expansion of the intelligence network, like how many people were involved all total at the beginning of the war, and then how many at the end of the war? Because I think that's
so you look at Army code breaking, for instance. You have maybe you have about 50 people all told in Washington as code breakers. Yeah, there's some people supporting them in the field, but one of the things to bear in mind is they're part of the Army Signal Corps, so there could be somebody who's dual-hatted out in the field. So roughly, think you know, low numbers, 2 digits in 1941, and then by the end of the war, the same office would have maybe 5,000 people working there. OSS peaked at 13,000. You know, so they go from 0 to 13,000. You have a similar growth. FBI was in existence before the war, but they too peaked at around 13,000 during the war as they added people. So basically you go from 2 digits up into the thousands, and then it dials back after the war, initially when people are demobilized. But one of the important takeaways here, as I mentioned when I was talking about the personalities, is we don't send everyone home the way we had in previous wars. I mean, American intelligence existed in almost all the country's wars from the beginning. George Washington liked spies. He spent a lot of money on them. And but when the war was over, they said, well, we don't need spies anymore. we won the war or it got settled or whatever. And so then you got to wait till the next war to start the process over again. So World War II is the first time that we don't do that. And so that's another reason that this topic's important, because it's the foundations of this big system that still exists today.
Yeah, I think those numbers are pretty astounding. So we have a question about what, I know you covered this quite a bit in your book. What kind of intelligence briefings did Roosevelt receive? From whom, how often, daily, weekly, and how secure were the documents? And particularly with this a question from George, in light of what we've seen recently with ex-presidents and ex-vice presidents carrying home classified documents to their residence. Was that something that occurred at that time, or were they more tightly controlled?
So mostly the answer is yes, it was more tightly controlled. So as I mentioned earlier, you would have a briefer come over with be military aid, Navy or Army, and he would have a briefcase, and he would either share it with the president. He'd unlock the briefcase, share it with the decision maker, or hand it to somebody who was authorized to brief, like the military aide, the permanent military aide at the White House was a guy named General Watson, Pa Watson. And so Pa would take the briefcase from the courier, who sometimes was also the briefer, but in this case, you can think of Pa as the briefer, and Pa would present it to the president, and Roosevelt was Roosevelt, as I said, was not a good customer. Roosevelt would get his briefing while he was shaving or having his sinuses packed. He had terrible sinus problems throughout the war, and the remedy in those days was to push pieces of gauze up into his nose for a few minutes. And can you imagine, somebody saying, well, here we have this report on strategic bombing in Europe, and while somebody is either shaving you or but anyway, to answer the question, what happened next was everything was numbered, and the documents would be taken back and consigned to an incinerator in if it was an Army report in the War Department, and when it failed, when they came up short, they went looking for it. And in one case, they found that Pa Watson, instead of handing things back to the courier, had just tossed them into the unclassified trash. So controls were a good bit tighter, and it would have been hard for Roosevelt to take something home or put it in the Roosevelt Library. Roosevelt Library, by the way, was the first presidential library established. I'm pretty sure of that, and it was established in his lifetime. And so Donovan, William J. Donovan, the OSS guy, did take a lot of documents home at the end of the war. He did it on purpose. He wanted to have control over the history of OSS, maybe even write it himself. So he copied hundreds, maybe thousands of documents, and moved them to his office. He did it himself with one aide. And for those who doubt me, you can go to the National Archives and you can look at the films, and the films show his hands on the screen, holding down the document as it's passed through the microfilm machine, which was about the size of a sewing machine. And so they did frame by frame. His last 2 weeks in office, he spent in the office at night doing this. And that he did it at night and did it himself suggests that he was aware that this wasn't exactly what government employees were supposed to do.
Yeah, so we are running short time. There are two questions I want to get in, and the first one, it's not a topic of your book, but maybe you can speak to it. You talk about the Navajo code talker's role.
So I don't really cover that. Again, it's sort of like the Mrs. Friedman thing. It's an important part of the story, but it's not. It's not part of the foundations of post-war intelligence, which is kind of where I'm going in the book. And the Navajo code talkers, they're mostly in the Marine Corps uniform, and I was told by a Navajo who'd been in the Marine Corps that they preferred the Marine Corps because the Army had fought the American Indians and the Marine Corps had not, which is 90% true. Anyway, so their language was unwritten, and so the Japanese couldn't go buy a dictionary, the Navajo dictionary, and so you'd put a Navajo on each end of a tactical communications link, and so they could talk basically in code. It took a little while to get this running properly because Navajo didn't have words. The Navajo language didn't have words like aircraft carrier and napalm and machine gun, but it worked, and they made an important contribution to communications in World War II.
Okay, I think this is going to be the final question. So I think it's interesting. It says Jack says, I believe that Truman in his memoirs said founding the CIA was his biggest mistake. Is that true? And I guess if you give any perspective on that.
So there is a passage in Truman's memoirs, and so it's a little past my period, where so the CIA, my book ends in 46, the CIA was founded in 47, and there is a passage where he's critical of the CIA, and there's a dispute among historians whether that was Truman himself speaking or one of his aides who slipped it in. There is if you look at a Dulles biography, you'll see Dulles responded to that and said, well, that doesn't accord with his memories of working with President Truman, about whom he had only nice things to say. So I would take it with a grain of salt. I would want to investigate it a little further. I think Truman was in favor of central intelligence with at this point a small c and a small I. Where you go at the end of the war doesn't necessarily wind you up at a CIA, capital CIA, as it is known today. There are a lot of moving parts there. And the reason I celebrate Truman as a hero is that he's working on this issue in a more or less organized way, far more organized than Roosevelt had been.
Okay, thanks for that perspective, and I want to thank the audience for all the great questions. We, did not get to all the questions, and I apologize, but time has run out on us. But I want to thank you, Nick, for coming on and enlightening us. And also, I read the book. I think it's fantastic. I encourage everyone in the audience to read it. There's still a lot more information beyond what we covered today. We covered a lot. But thank you so much for Nick. I don't know if you have any parting summary words or not.
So, I guess if I had to leave you with parting words, I would once again celebrate the greatest generation. It's just, I don't think we've seen this kind of mostly selfless behavior and this aggregation of talent. Again, sure, I can't say there are people, good things happen after the war, but I do salute the World War II generation. I do salute the ones who worked in intelligence, and I also like to say that the national interest came first. So you had guys who were Republicans, you had guys who were Democrats, and they shelved that for the war. Donovan hated the New Deal, and so did Secretary Stimson and Secretary Knox. But they basically joined a national unity government and gave it their all. So that's another reason I particularly like this generation. The amount of political backbiting, party political backbiting. So there were some disputes, obviously, about organization and whatnot. But the national unity was real in World War II. No unit. Very limited unity before the war. There's a great book called Those Angry Days by a historian named Lynn Olson, and that talks about the really deep divide in American society before World War II that is something like what we see today. And so after Pearl Harbor, you see people saying, well, that was then, this is now, and let's get together and do the nation's work. And you see people doing this, willingly, and they're not taking footnotes. They're not crossing their fingers when they're swearing the oath. So I guess my parting words are my hat's off to the World War II generation.
Thank you very much for that perspective. It certainly was a different world back then, and I thank you for your contribution of the book, and thank you for coming on and giving us a little snippet of what is in that book.